Welcome to another episode of Learning with Belvista Studios. I'm super excited today to have Brendan Jarvis with us. Brendan Jarvis is the managing founder of The Space in Between. So it's New Zealand's only world-class UX lab. And they do testing and design and create products with their real users, testing and giving them insights. So at Belvista Studios, it is super inspiring for us because we love human-centered design. We love putting our users at the heart of our process, and that is what Brendan does. So it's really epic to have you on this episode, Brendan. What we'd love to learn about in this episode is user interviews. So it's something we do in our team, but I know that you would have a lot more insight, Brendan, into running them. So I'm really, really excited to learn from you. So thanks for being here.
It's great to be here, Hannah. Thanks for having me on the show. Well, we're about to find out whether or not that's true, but we'll go with that for now.
Oh, you're epic. You've already been on the show and it was so good. You've already proven yourself. So my first question is, I would love to know from your perspective why user interviews are important.
Why are user interviews important? They're really important for understanding your users. And I know that sounds obvious, but it's quite often, and it still happens, that solutions to perceived problems get made without any real understanding of who the users are and whether or not the problem you're trying to solve is a real one. So early on in the design process, a user interview is really helpful for understanding how the user sees the world or the particular problem space that you're looking to solve, and for confirming what your initial hypothesis or idea might be as to how that looks for them. And there's really only one way of doing that and not to guess, and that's actually to sit down with users and have a conversation.
Awesome. Love it. Well, you answered my next question because I was wondering what stage of the project you would suggest to do user interviews, and it sounds like at the very beginning is the best time to do it.
It's certainly one important time to do it. A lot of the times we're also, as part of our usability tests, running interviews as a technique throughout the usability test and at the end, just to better understand some of the things that we saw. So it's not only at the beginning of a design project that can be worked into something like a usability test if you're talking about a digital product. And that's really just, as I said, just to really understand the reasons why you might have seen friction in the solution that you presented. But yeah, there are generally two areas that we use them for anyway. One is when we're trying to understand the problem and in a way that we can get some insights to shape the solution better. And then once we have the solution, to actually understand how that performs and why there might be issues that we observe in any usability test that we run.
Yeah, love it. It just makes so much sense. Like when you think about it, we're designing products for these people, for our users. And I think if you don't consider them or understand their context or what's going to work for them, like it's going to be very difficult to create something that works for them. So it just makes much sense. So I think it's so great that you have that UX lab, because I think it is so important to consider your user, and it does have such a big impact.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time we would find when we were designers ourselves and we've stopped doing actual design work, we just help other designers understand how the users feel and experience the work that they're creating. But we found that we would often get these personas that were marketing driven or market research driven. You know, they were very much demographic based. And I just wanted to, before we move on, just mention that running interviews are really important at the beginning of the process, particularly when you're trying to shape a meaningful persona for who your users actually are. And it's quite different than taking that sort of top-down market research approach. You're actually spending the time with a number of users that represent the audience that you're trying to create a solution for. And then you're able to shape your persona around the things that you hear and the insights that you gather from those interviews.
Yeah. Another question I've just thought of. So how many people should you interview, do you think? Like, is there a percentage or a sort of formula for how many people you should interview to get accurate representation of the population?
Yeah, I would say 5 is a minimum, but really it's after you stop hearing new insights. So, you know, that could, I mean, that's unlikely to happen in less than 5, but say you get to 7 and then you get to 8 and you're kind of just hearing the same things, you've probably heard all it is that you need to know about the line of questioning that you're asking by that point. So there's no hard and fast. I'd say anything less than 5, you're probably a little bit too skinny in your insights. But once you get past, once you stop hearing new things, is probably a good time just to consider stopping.
Yeah, okay. I love that. That's really cool. We usually do about 5 as well.
Yeah.
So the founder of Belvista Studios, Kim, which you know very well, she says 5. She thinks that's when you start hearing the same thing as well. So, yeah.
Oh, good. Well, she won't tell me off next time we're chatting, and that I've contradicted.
Yeah. Okay, so I stepped into the shoes of someone who's never held an interview before, and I know I've been in that position. And even now, I still get nervous before interviews because I'm thinking, have I prepared and have I done everything that I need to do? What tips do you have to help people prepare for running interviews, user interviews?
Yeah, I think the first thing, which is probably sounds like I'm stating the obvious, is know why it is that you're running the interview. What are you trying to learn?
Yeah.
And you probably shouldn't have more than 3 questions that you're trying to answer. Ideally, not 3 questions that you're asking, but 3 main things that you're trying to learn, 3 outcomes, no more than 3. Otherwise, your interview is going to be too broad and you're going to need way too much time. You won't be able to condense the conversation into the time that you'll have with the participant or the user. So know the goal is really important. An example that I can think of for that is, what are some of the, this is hypothetical, right? But if you're speaking to fathers of newborn children, you might want to know what the challenges are for those first time fathers and the first couple of months after the birth of a baby. So, you want to be quite specific about what it is that you're trying to learn. And then you can shape your interview, your discussion guide for that interview around that. So once you know what you're going to ask, you're going to be able to break down what we call a discussion guide. And that's going to have probably some topic areas that you want to cover. And then within each of those topic areas, you're going to have a series of questions.
Okay. So you wouldn't have set questions. Potentially, as you're going through the interview, it could change. And you could be asking questions that help you meet your goal. If you can think of things where you think, I need to ask that to help me meet my goal, it could change.
Yeah, we call it semi-structured. So we don't go in completely with a blank piece of paper, but we leave some room for exploration of things that might be interesting as they come up. So the issue of, structure is quite important. So you need some, but you don't want to be so rigid that it feels like some sort of interrogation of the user where you're just literally going down the list of questions, So the preparation, though, is the thing that, as an interviewer, gives you more confidence going in. And the structure is also the thing that once you take the interview across multiple users or participants, that actually, when you go to analyze what you've heard, you've actually had enough structure in there so that you are hearing answers that you can then theme and appropriately gain some insights from. So you do need some structure.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah. And I'd say also have more questions than you think you'll have time for, because there's nothing worse than running out of something to say and not being able to think of something interesting, especially if you're new at this or something useful to ask. So have a few more than you think you might have time for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Good advice. And how about when you start the interviews? Do you have, is there like a blurb or something that you say around what you say is confidential, or what do you begin with?
Yeah, for sure. So you want to really think about a few things, and even before you run the interview, you really should think about the context and the location that you're going to have the interview in, because a lot of research, right, is about trying to get people relaxed enough with where they are and who you are, so that you can actually get into the really interesting topics and territories that you're there to find out about. So, for example, if you work in a busy office environment, it's probably not the right thing to conduct the interview in the middle of the office floor. You want to go somewhere that is quiet and people can speak confidently and that you'll be able to hear them, especially if you're recording. So consider where you're going to go. You also want to be warm. While you might want to adopt a mindset of a detective, you don't want to run it like an interrogation. So, don't forget to smile. You don't have to be best friends, but before you go into an interview, even before you've met the participant, it's a good idea to sort of get your body posture right and get your mindset right and smile. It really helps before you go into those conversations. So yeah, there's a bit of preparation in terms of that. Once you're in the interview, yes, there are some really important steps. So if you are running research, you usually will have to seek consent, because this is an ethical obligation that you have as a researcher, and it is a formality, but it's also a really important thing for the user or the participant to understand, what is the purpose of the research? How is the information going to be used? Who are you and what company do you represent? What can they do if they feel uncomfortable in the interview? Can they leave at any time? How will the data be stored? And what do they do if they want to withdraw their consent? So if they decide tomorrow or in a year's time, how do they actually get hold of the data, and how do they delete it effectively from wherever you're storing it if they choose to revoke that? So yeah, that is quite important. And so is some housekeeping, right? You want to tell them things like where the bathrooms are, and you want to ask them, would you like a drink before we get started? So those kind of things can help people feel more relaxed and sort of understand what where things are and what to do. You also want to let them know how long it's going to take, and just go through some of those basics so that they've got some idea as to how long they might be there.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like that is so important, because you want them to feel comfortable, because you're right, like when people feel comfortable, they're more likely to share their truth and not try and rush through the interview or feel uncomfortable. And I think sometimes even I can be so caught up in my process and in like work mode, and I've got these questions I have to get through. So I think that's just a really good reminder to also think about the building rapport part and helping them feel calm and relaxed and not being like interrogating them. Because I think sometimes I could potentially come across that way, because I'm very like, I have all these questions I need answered and I'm like going one by one. So that's
you're very good. I mean, just before we started recording this session, you asked me some basic questions about how I was and what was going on, and it's kind of like, you got to ease into these things. People can feel quite anxious coming in for some research, and really want to sort of start off softly and then build into the more meatier questions for your conversation. It's getting the balance between being warm and natural, but also realizing that you're there to do research. So you still have to have that detective mindset at the behind the scenes, and not sympathize with them. So there's a difference between sympathy and empathy. You want to be able to hold their feeling, but not affect the way that you ask questions after feeling that, so that you're biasing or feeling too much of that emotion and conditioning your responses as a result. So it's a tricky one, but it's practice.
Yeah, well, something I've noticed that I do, and I'm thinking I did it once and I was like, I probably shouldn't have done that. But I think it's really hard sometimes when they say something that you really agree with. And I was like, I was like nodding, and I sort of had to stop myself, because I'm like, I can't, like, because as the interviewer, you really need to you have to have no biases, right? You just need to ask questions and don't agree or disagree with what they're saying.
I mean, there is some nuance to that. So, if someone's recounting like quite a sad story or something like that, there's nothing wrong, I don't think anyway, and some other researchers might disagree, but I don't think there's anything wrong with showing concern on, in your emotion, like how you're responding to them in your body language, because I feel like the least appropriate thing to do in that response, in that situation, would be just to blank slate it like a robot.
And it doesn't feel good either. It doesn't feel natural to not respond.
Yeah, but there's a difference between like showing them through your body language that that you understand that what they're telling you is really important, and then overlaying your own opinion into the situation or injecting yourself into the interview. So it's sort of stopping short of sort of giving your own life experience as part of it, because you're not there for them to learn about you. You're there for you to learn about them.
Yeah, definitely. Love it. So I would love to know as well, how do you record the information that you obtain from user interviews? So do you like use a tape recorder or do you write it down? Because I often take notes and sometimes I find it is hard because I'm trying to like give them the attention they need as well as writing. So yeah, I was just wondering if you had any tips around that.
Yeah, so we're quite fortunate at the space in between with the lab. So the room that I'm in at the moment is our research room, and it's actually all mic'd up and all camera'd up, so that if we're just down here one-on-one with a participant, people above us in the observation room are able to actually see and take notes independent of the researcher. So that's really useful because it means that we can maintain our attention on the interview. I mean, there's nothing worse than being interviewed and someone's constantly taking notes and not paying attention to you. You know, like you break that rapport that you've tried so hard to build, and you also can lose the flow of the interview and you can miss things that are important because you can't take notes as quickly as people can speak. So sometimes people suggest if you don't have a setup like this and you're running it, say at the customer's office or wherever it is, at a cafe, you might want to take someone else with you and introduce them and make sure that the person knows that they're there to take notes. You're there to ask the questions and do it that way so that you can still stay focused on that conversation.
Yeah, love it. I think that is really important because you're right. If someone is writing and looking down the whole time, you can break that rapport. And they might think you're not listening to what I'm saying now because you're writing down what I said earlier. So I think that's a really good point. It's definitely a lesson that I've learned because I thought I could do it. But then when it played out, I was like, oh gosh, there's so much to write.
Multitasking is difficult.
Yeah, I can't do it. It's too hard.
Yeah. I think with that as well, it's if you do find yourself needing to jot down something that's really important and there's no one else to do it for you and you're not recording, don't forget that you can use verbal but non-spoken cues like and little cues like that, or a head nod or something, or just some brief eye contact that shows them that you're still listening. So most people do that naturally anyway, but it's something that you can break.
Yeah, it's usually our natural response. We're not always robotic, are we?
Yeah.
Sometimes nervous it can happen, but I think if you just let yourself be natural and be yourself, it comes across a lot nicer.
Yeah,
cool. So once you've run the interview, how do you bring together all of your insights and make sense of what's just happened and all the information you've got?
Yeah, there are a number of things that we do. So if we've recorded, which we almost always would do, at least audio, we'd put it through a tool called otter.ai. And Otter is AI-based transcription, and it's fairly accurate. It does create some fairly hilarious misunderstandings, particularly of our New Zealand accents from time to time. So I'm not sure how it is with the Australian or the American accents, but I suspect it might be a bit better. So we use that. That's really cool because we put that into a tool which we use as a research repository called Dovetail. And that's actually a New Zealand Australian startup, I believe. It's one of the founders is a Kiwi, but it's based in Sydney, if I'm remembering correctly. It's a great tool, really useful. That's kind of for like longer term storage. It lets you pull out interesting quotes and tag things with certain themes and things like that. But generally, you'll be in a team situation. So what you want to do is if you've got really great notes and you're able to bring those along to a sort of a workshop or a team-based setting, you can start to post-it things up on the wall, the key moments or observations or answers or challenges that you observed in that interview. And then you can start to theme and group them into areas that make sense for you to then explore further.
I like that. It is good to have it visually like that sometimes, having it in there, because it is hard if you're going through different, for us, it's like a document per interview. And I sort of like highlight and try and figure out what the themes are, but that's really nice to do it in a visual way. Yeah,
so once you've done that hard work of sort of, looking at on the full transcription and maybe going over your recording, then yes, I think it's important to take the perspective up and sort of put it up on a wall. I think it's easier to do that kind of joining of the dots when you've got a wider view of what the things are that you might be trying to join. It's more difficult if you're focused on a screen or on paper, documents. It's definitely good to bring it up.
Definitely. And what happens if you have really different perspectives? So if like half the users are saying one thing and the other half saying another thing, how do you deal with like really different opinions?
Yeah, so I suppose with user interviews, you're not normally doing enough of them that you would get, and they're not structured in a way that you get statistical significance out of it. But what you could do is, if you've got a situation like that where there seems to be half saying they love something and half saying they hate something, or whatever it may be, it's actually the genesis of another research question, because it's telling you something maybe about the way that you structured your interview, or it's telling you something about your audience that you don't quite yet fully understand. So you might want to step back from that and have a look at it and think about the situation. You know, what is it that we're missing here? You know, should we be asking another question that we haven't quite formed? You know, is this the basis of the next round of research that we need to conduct?
Yeah.
In your hypothetical, that's how I would look at it anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else you would like to share to help people run user interviews smoothly? Because I know you've done it and you would have a lot of wisdom around it. So there's probably questions I haven't asked that may elicit more. So is there anything that comes to mind that would be really useful for me, my team, and the listeners today?
Well, you just used one of the techniques that I think is useful, which is what some people call the Columbo technique, which is at the end of a conversation when you feel like you've got some closure, you ask a question like that, and then that gives the other person an opportunity to open up and share something else they may have been wanting to say. So that's a really great technique, and you just demonstrated that really well. Kim and I in the past have spoken about a book called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, and he's actually an FBI negotiator, or was. So this is kind of like, going into some pretty interesting psychological territory here, but these are quite common techniques he talks about too. So one of them is mirroring. So if, for example, someone says something interesting, like, you ask me something, actually, just say something. I'll ask you something, actually. So I'll ask you, what was the most difficult thing about preparing for this interview?
Thinking of the right questions to get the information that I need.
The right questions?
Yeah, I see what you're doing. Yeah, like thinking of the questions that I would ask that would help me get what I want. And I think sometimes it's really hard to draft questions in a way that it's going to get you the information that you need. So that was the hardest part.
Cool. Yeah. So I suppose what we're illustrating there is you don't actually have to necessarily ask a follow-up question. The mirror is repeating the last couple of words or 3 words or the important words within the response that you got back from your question. And what it does is it opens up permission for the person to continue to explain. So if you don't quite understand something, or you want to go deeper into it, you know, you don't have to hammer with questions all the time. You can use a technique like the mirror to get further into it, into territory with someone.
That's really cool.
The other thing I would say is don't be afraid of silence. So we have a tendency as humans to not deal so well with silence, and we step in and try and fill it. You lose the opportunity to learn things if you do that too soon. You don't want to leave people hanging out so long that it's totally awkward, right? Like I said, it's not an actual interrogation. You are, you're not there to sort of put them under lights and make them sweat. But don't rush in too soon. You know, you'll miss out on some stuff. And I think the last thing that I would suggest is, after you've run an interview, don't leave it too long before you do your analysis or your retrospective. You know, like you want to get into that while it's relatively fresh. And you also want to go back over your discussion guide, and you want to think about what were the questions in there that didn't fire, as in work well. Why didn't they work well? Is it because it's a bad question, or I phrased it strangely? You know, did it confuse the participant? Did it get a negative reaction? So you want to have some reflection on how you're structuring your conversations, because ideally from the first one you learn something and you refine, and then the second one you refine, and you just get to a much better script at the end of it, better discussion guide. Yeah,
I found that as well, definitely. I've done interviews where the first it's like one question where people just don't respond very well, or they're confused, and it just you don't get the information that you need. And you're right, like it's really good to keep refining as you go on. And I like that you said you don't have to have a strict structure of you have to ask these exact questions, because if they're not working, it's just about meeting your goal. I really like thinking of it in that way. What goal am I trying to achieve, and what do I need to ask?
Yeah, 100%. And what and how questions are your friends as well. You know, the open questions. Yeah, keep as many of them as you can in your discussion guide. You know, try not to ask too many closed questions. Try not to prime people's answers. There are lots of good guides for this, and you can see people running mock interviews that'll give you a good idea if you don't know what those things are. Probably we don't have time today to go into them, but definitely do your own research, and don't be afraid to try new things and practice and think about what it is that you've learned. Yeah,
I love it. Is there anywhere that you would like to direct the listeners to where they could learn more about running user interviews? I know you have your, is it Brave UX, your show? I think that would be for people to watch, to learn more about UX and find what the users need.
If you're generally interested in user research and UX in particular, then Brave UX is probably quite good. They're quite broad-ranging discussions, less so on the practical aspects of how to do things. There are some really good resources. The one that comes to mind immediately is the Nielsen Norman Group website. So that's nng.com, and they're in the UX usability space, not necessarily like in the instructional design space, but they've got some great video resources. A lot of them are quite short as well, and they go through and explain some of the techniques that apply across the broad spectrum of human-centered design, not just their specific niche. But there are bound to be heaps of others out there as well.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brendan. For anyone listening, if you are an instructional designer, human-centered design and doing UX like what Brendan does is incredible for our industry. We have found it is amazing for the training solutions that we create. And you deal with digital products, Brendan, and that's what us as instructional designers are often doing. We're creating online learning, and through doing user interviews and running activities like you do, Brendan, it does make a really big impact on our process. So please take notes. If you need to listen back, just listen to what Brendan's saying, because he does have a lot of experience. He's done UX stuff before, and it can add value to your project. So thank you so much, Brendan. Where can people find you if people would like to connect or learn more from you?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. You can find me on Twitter at Brendan Jarvis. You can also find me on LinkedIn on the same if you want to connect. And the Space in Between website is thespaceinbetween.co.nz.
Awesome. Well, I'll put it, everyone listening, it's in the description below. So check out the links in the description below. Everything that Brendan and I have spoken about, you can access there. And thank you so much for taking the time to be here, Brendan.
Great to be here, Hannah. Thanks, everyone.